Okay, hello everyone. A very warm welcome to our first international edition of NParks Wildlife Management webinar series. Thank you all for joining us on Zoom. My name is Corinne, and together with my colleague Dr. Benjamin Lee, we'll be your host for this morning. In line with transforming Singapore into a city in nature, raising awareness and understanding of wildlife will be the key to allowing communities to safely share spaces with wildlife and enjoy the benefits of living close to nature. In this Wildlife Management webinar series, International Edition, we seek out international subject matter experts to better understand how countries manage human-wildlife encounters. To facilitate today's Q&A session, we'll be using Slido. During the sharing, you can start submitting questions using the QR code shown, or head to slido.com and enter the event code 2253383 to participate. Without further ado, I'll hand the time over to Ben, who will share more about our speaker for today.
Okay, thank you, Corinne. For today's webinar, it gives me great pleasure to introduce Dr. Melvin Gumal, Head of the Biodiversity Conservation and Research Division of the Sarawak Forestry Corporation, or FSC in short. Melvin has an illustrious career in wildlife management, to say the least. He studied forest science, the environment and development and conservation at the Universities of Melbourne and Cambridge. He started out in the Sarawak Forest Department as the head of the Education and Interpretation Unit, where he co-developed the Sarawak Wildlife Master Plan. He then spent 18 years as the country director of Wildlife Conservation Society's Malaysia program, working at the forefront to conserve orangutans, elephants, and tigers through research, field interventions, and stakeholder engagement. And thanks to the excellent work of him and his team to conserve orangutans in Sarawak, he was honored with the Whitley Award in 2014 for ape conservation. In 2020, he returned to civil service at SFC to oversee the applied research and conservation in 7 sections. So today he will be sharing about SFC's work ranging from plant to terrestrial and marine fauna conservation in Sarawak. This includes the creation of protected areas to staff working on some aspects of human-wildlife conflict. So pay close attention as upcoming collaborative work with corporations and other stakeholders will also be highlighted. And just a bit of housekeeping, after the sharing, we'll be having an interactive Q&A session. As mentioned earlier, to facilitate today's Q&A session, we'll be using Slido. The instructions are in the Zoom chat. Over the course of Melvin's sharing, you can head over to Slido to start submitting questions, and we will try to answer as many questions as we can during the Q&A. And the event code is 225-3383. I'll say again, 225-3383. That is the event code. But for now, without further ado, I'll hand over the time to Melvin, who will regale us with his interesting talk. Melvin, please.
Thank you, Ben, for such a generous offering of my career. I'm already, some of my younger people are already calling me ancient. So this is what would be my original frontispiece for my PowerPoint. So the younger ones decided that that's a little bit ancient. Let's give him this. It doesn't want to move. What's going on? There. They decided, let's have a bit of fun with it and make it a little bit lighter and add a whole bunch of virtual stuff to make it look snazzier. So this came from one of my marine biologists, Mia, and she said, essentially, let's make it more fun in terms of giving this presentation, and seeing that NParks, I'm in a room full of younger people, I think it'll work a little bit better than the old one. So what I'm going to do is give you a piece of what our work entails, and I have had to indicate that it's not as fun as what you'll see in the Marvel movies like Thor, Love and Thunder, Spider-Man and all that. It's conservation, but hey, look, it's what excites a whole bunch of us. And this is in between number 2 and to 5 are some of the items that I'll be talking about in general, but concentrating on a thing called human-wildlife conflicts, because that's what was asked of me earlier on. So a larger part of the presentation will be on that. In terms of Sarawak, Sarawak itself, Sarawak Forestry Corporation currently manages 67 protected areas in the state, of which the total sum is over 2.1 million hectares. We protect all totally protected and protected species. We enhance conservation by way of looking at protection for its indigenous flora and fauna, and we develop nature-based and community-based ecotourism products. We have a thing called a set of strategic thrusts, and it involves these 4: conservation, rural transformation, because we actually have a whole bunch of people living in the rural areas close to our protected areas, ecotourism, and revenue generation. This is Sarawak by way of land area. We occupy 37.4% of the land mass of Malaysia. And in terms of Singapore, it would be at the bottom part of Peninsular Malaysia, and I can't remember the size in comparison, but by way of our marine aspect, Sarawak's EEZ occupies 47.8% of the marine landscape in Malaysia. This is the length and breadth of our protected area system, and the proposed protected area system in Sarawak. We actually have 67, and it runs up to 2.1 million hectares. I had several interesting conversations with Ben and various other people just the last few days, where we were discussing about conservation and CITES. And I discovered that our protected area system is 70 times that size of your current one in Singapore. In terms of the land mass, I think Singapore is 0.6% of Sarawak's land mass, and your marinescapes is 0.26. And our numbers of staff are a fraction of what you guys have. And it is amazing watching the amount of work done by NParks, the detailed work that's being done. It's something which we in Sarawak also aspire for, and kudos to NParks for progressing at this rate. By way of the ecotourism work that we're doing, currently we actually are going after World Heritage Site listings in NIA. We actually have urban walks in Samajaya, the world famous pinnacles in Mulu, a World Heritage Site. And these are some of the attractions that we actually have in our totally protected areas in Sarawak. Among the 67, we actually have manned and unmanned parks. We do conservation work on things like hornbills. At dinner last night, Mandai were chatting with us about helmeted hornbills and such. We have worked with Hornbill Foundation in Thailand, putting nest boxes out on the ground to try to improve nesting for hornbills in the state. We also work on orangutans and various other animals, but I'll just give a fleeting broad brush over these, because I'm going to be talking largely on other items such as human-wildlife conflict. This is one of our most famous hornbills. Jimmy is in Piasau, and she and another female hornbill were essentially these two birds secured a nature reserve, a large one, prime land to be looked into for development and made into a nature reserve. And this essentially, these two iconic birds are the ones that galvanize conservation and remove land from development to be made into a nature reserve. So if people say sometimes development overrides conservation, not all the time. sometimes they actually are able to hold on. And where you actually have a whole bunch of people interested, politicians also do take note. And when it's closer to a sensitive time where votes count, these things do sometimes work in our favor. We work on turtles in Sarawak. In the more than 20 years ago, things like satellite tracking of turtles are also conducted in Sarawak, and we found that these turtles essentially move from the southernmost coast of Sarawak all the way up to the Philippines, and there are satellite tracking data for these things as well. On top of that, we actually try, because we actually had a lot of turtle deaths, over 100 a year in the 1990s, we then embarked on a thing called reef ball deployment. When I get back to Sarawak, the next day I fly to Bintulu to watch the last of the deployment of these items. The ones on the right, if you can see on the image, there's a dome with orange bubble-looking things. Those items are reef balls, and we are deploying over 16,000 reef balls along the migration route of the turtles from the southern coast of Sarawak all the way up to Lawas, the top, the northern part, with the aim to allow for the turtles to be able to move freely. On top of that, what we have actually done, that will be the end of phase 1, the total sum of which is 70 million. The commencement of phase 2 is supposed to start next year, where we will look into the deployment of a whole cluster of reef balls at several different locations, with the aim and sole purpose of creating things like a new national park. This reef ball deployment actually will form the baseline for Sarawak's longest marine park, 1,000 kilometers by 6 kilometers, which is 600,000 hectares. Then within those, what we're going to also do is increase the ecological capacity in those marine parks in a way. When you actually add more reef balls, you actually have coral growing and so on. We are going to have tourism activities around those reef balls away from the actually important sensitive areas, so that tourism can actually see the same kinds of reef, but we protect the core. That's one win that we are going for, the creation of the marine park. The second win is the allowance of things like scuba diving activities and so on. The third one is also at the outside the protected areas, creating a marine mariculture growth of coral, whereby we actually then will look into harvest of coral, getting things like the grandchild of the coral, F2, so that somebody needs to admit that, right? So that you actually have F2 to be able to be traded for the aquariums and so on. But even with that, we actually have a 50% with an agreement for 50% of all that mariculture growth to be retained in the marine parks. And finally, things like there are also anglers coming into the state wanting to look at fishing. We are creating zones through the beyond the protected areas with the clusters, so that local people can artisanal fisher folks will be able to do fishing and enjoy local catches, and as part of all the tourism trade as well. So in other words, we are actually doing 4 wins with the creation of the marine park, but we are actually using zonation to try to get it done in such a manner. And the state is pushing that we use conservation in such a manner, but we actually have to rethink about how we use conservation so that we don't destroy the environment. Because right now, the language of the whole time period for the last 30 years is a term called sustainable development. The assumption as we can grow forever and ever. I don't subscribe to that personally. So the term that we are actually approximating right now is sustainable futures. It is one which we actually have controlled consumerism and so on. Let's move on. So other items that we are doing are things like this, where we actually have enforcement work and protection work. And these are the some of the species that we go out and catch. For example, right now there's a discussion within with NParks itself, the numbers of songbirds and all that we are going to be putting into Panama and so on. So all those items are extremely useful as background information across the landscape of Sarawak, where our songbirds are available, not available, and so on, or observed and not observed. And here is what has happened the last year or so, where we caught a whole bunch of people doing nefarious activities like killing pangolins and selling their scales. And our fines are now currently the highest in Malaysia. Altogether, it's over 52 million ringgit converted. It's about 17 million Sing in this time period alone. And what we've actually done is try to use the law as a deterrence. We actually have had cases in Malaysia where if you do find the maximum fine, for example, about less than 5 years ago, you actually had a tiger which was killed, and the fine was about 70,000 ringgit. The tiger was quartered. That afternoon, the poacher and the handler came in with 70,000 ringgit, and the poacher was able to go away free. However, if you actually have a 20 million fine, there is no way the middleman, the middle person, would be wanting to spend that kind of money. So the guy or the woman goes in jail. So in this instance, the utility of such fines would mean putting the person in prison. Apart from that, we do research. This is a tree going by way of all the different MOUs that are in place since 2015. Right now, as of yesterday, we would have another 7 to be signed in Sarawak before the end of the year in front of the Premier. Our Chief Minister is called the Premier. And there will be another 7 coming up before the end of the year, ranging from the Spaniards, Louisiana, the Japanese group, and so on. So in other words, we're investing in research with collaborators across the world. By way of things that we found, from plants to bugs and bugsies. So if you, last night was a most interesting walk at your Marina Bay Gardens, and we saw all that begonia. On the leftmost are the new species of begonias found in Sarawak between the years of 2016 to 2018. And a slew of specimens are now being found, including permits to export another species to be identified in the UK, and another plant to be grown to see if it is a completely new species. So because of the large landscape that we are in, and more and greater detail in terms of research, we're finding a whole bunch of extra new things which are in the landscape. And interactions with your NUS and your NParks people yesterday, there's a whole bunch of young interns who are so passionate in their work and wanting to do research. It'll be really nice to actually have some of them roaming our landscapes to help us do all these discoveries. So let's get to crocodiles, because this is something which I was asked to look at. And Paul Hogan on the right, we're not doing exactly just that, but we actually have large crocs that we actually have to work with. Now, we do have these two, the false gharial and our local term for the estuarine crocodile, which we call buaya katak. The ones on the left are the ones that appear much more, appear larger, appear more, people do get a bit much more interested in them because they can grow huge, but there's also a gentle concern about them. We don't do things like this with our crocs, but we do things like this. We create large sites for them where they can roam around free, where we actually have healthy populations of them. And if you guys come across to Sarawak, we can take you guys out there. You can watch them basking in the sun. Yesterday, I was in Sungai Buloh to try to look at the resident croc there, but the tide was high, so the croc was not to be spotted, but I was asked to imagine that is there. Now, what happened was early in the mid 1980s, we actually had very low numbers of crocs in the state. And we did a thing called, because of the protection accorded them, the numbers and the percentage-wise increase of crocs jumped from 6 to over 337 crocs per kilometer. With all this success came other things. Humans became concerned, crocodile attacks became a concern because we do have a large rural community living out there. This is data between 2011 to June 2020 on the number of crocodile attacks that we have had. If you look at it, it's 131 in the 11 years and 73 fatalities and 58 injuries. And the age groups of these people that were attacked or killed. And interestingly, 10% of all our attacks occur in oil palm plantation areas, primarily because the oil palm is planted literally next to the rivers. And I've actually been to a site where two workers were taken while they were removing the oil palm fruits from the trees. We are not moving. Okay. We also have things like this because of the fact that we have to live with these crocodiles. We have a thing called the CRZs, the crocodile removal zones. These are areas which Sarawakians are supposed to live next to the waters and have it crocodile free. The rest then of Sarawak are, I wouldn't say human free, but it's a joke, sorry. It's where the crocs can actually live freely, if you will. So one takes the view that, yeah, we have a little sort of heaven for humans and a large set of heaven for the crocodiles. Again, it doesn't want to move properly. Oh, there we go. In the crocodile removal zones, we actually have these things that are put into the water to remove those crocs that go in. And in this what we call the CRZs or CRZs, there have been 0 attacks or incidents on humans since then. Now, for some of you, this could look quite interesting. This is an actual incident where a croc went into an oil palm plantation. And the people in green are the SFC staff trying to grapple with the crocodile. And the croc is not small, as you can see.
Thì bay tali, tali. Rồi cắt. Nha nha. Satu, dua, tiga. Apa nang laban deh?
The eyes are covered. The animal is alive. It's restrained. And for locations where there have been no crocodiles harming humans, they will then be released at a different site. There are, at the moment, sanctuary kind of areas, they'll be released in those areas. For those that are useful breeding animals, they could be sent to breeding farms. And these guys, the lead guy dressed in black, has no fear of crocodiles. Before they're identified for the work, they're essentially interviewed. And when they have no fear of crocodiles, they'll do this work. But the very, very interesting thing is this. When we actually had them meet with the CEO, they were so petrified of the human, but not of grappling with crocs. The set of values that these guys have is absolutely staggering, amazing. I find it absolutely amazing meeting these guys. Anyhow, let's move on. So these guys who do this work, initially when in 2013, we only had 4 of them. Now we actually have 28. The increase in numbers of staff follows the increase in the fact that the numbers of crocodiles have increased. So we are actually doing active management to try to ensure that you actually have CRZs, good for humans, and also an ability for the crocs to do well. Other kinds of work that we do are things like sun bear work removal. For example, I was mentioning to some of our guys, things like owls suddenly appearing in oil derricks out off the coast of Sarawak, and then they were rescued and re-released as part of the migration into Sarawak and beyond into the south and so on. So what are we doing in terms of trying to work with our crocs? We actually have a large 10-year project coming up because the crocs are actually doing well. And we actually have a dual goal of trying to make sure that we minimize human and wildlife conflict and also increase safety awareness among villagers. This 10-year project essentially then has a whole bunch of activities with the main themes and issues along these lines. Awareness programs, looking at where the CRZs, enlarging the CRZs so that humans can live freely, reducing where we can fatalities and all that by crocs, and also looking at conservation programs with regards to things like the false gharial. And we are running out of time by the sounds of it. And the actual impact of all that work along these lines, you actually have local communities who benefit from the work and solving the issues on the right in red. The proposed activities are these. We will monitor the crocodile population in 10 of the 22 river basins. We're going to create hotspot maps across the state to show where the crocodiles are and the conflict sites are. We are using latest technology. We are using drone technology, working with Sony Corporation in Japan and Aerosense and FunLead, using AI to look into things like presence of crocodiles, whether the numbers are going up or detection of them is going up, and looking at these other types of cages. Education activities across Sarawak, and things like where they cannot be existing, they would be removed, or in some set cases destroyed. We will update the master plan for our crocs, which is it's going through right now. It'll take us to the end of 2030. And because our crocs have actually done tremendously well, the listing for it actually went, in terms of CITES listing, went down. And these are creating maps for the plantation companies and communities so that they know where the crocs are. And finally, developing SOPs for these high-risk areas, because we don't want villagers to be doing the things on the right and then essentially being harmed. This last activity is an extremely important one for some of us. My grandfather was killed by a crocodile. My gardener's brother was killed by a crocodile this year, even when I mentioned not to go down to the ground. So I end with this other slide as a joke from my staff who decided to put me into a Harry Potter mode. And thank you very much.
Well, Melvin, thank you very much for sharing about the exciting work. Yes, Melvin, thank you very much for sharing about your exciting work happening in Sarawak. It was eye-opening even for me, especially with the crocodile management operations. We have got quite a few questions that have come in about after your talk, and I'd like to go through a few of them. The first one is actually, well, it's kind of grouped together with another one. The first one is actually about challenges that arise after the successful implementation of totally protected areas. What sort of challenges do you encounter? And the second part of that question is how effective are government outreach efforts to manage human-wildlife encounters, after you've managed these sort of protected areas, in those protected areas, how do you manage human-wildlife conflict?
The first one, after the creation of large protected areas or smaller protected areas, what you actually will see is communities that are living in and around these areas are asking, so what's the net benefit to us in terms of that creation of that protected area? Even though we actually have had FPIC engaged in it, we have had discussions with them before the area is protected, and we actually have them agreeing to the protected area. They will ask that question of how does it benefit us? So by way of, on our side, we need to look at literally a way to provide economic incentives, whether they are hired as workers in the protected area, or staff, or as tourist guides, or people managing lodging areas and sites in those areas, where you actually have a sustained revenue coming in you actually have a chance of holding on to those sites as protected areas. Now, having said that, there are those fly-by-nights that come through and will say things like, hey, look, that protected area has a whole bunch of really big trees. If you convert them, you can get the timber out of them. And if you put oil palm plantations into them, you'll get a sustained revenue. You do get those kinds of characters who want instant cash. Those items, in terms of changing the landscape of the totally protected area, do exist. And we then actually need to engage in a multi-stakeholder discussion to try to get the locals to understand that those kinds of revenue generation does not equate to clean waters, clear waters, when they go down to the rivers to brush their teeth. Because for those who have gone into things like large plantations, you wouldn't want to drink from the water in the plantation, in the rivers in those plantations. So those kinds of items we are acutely aware of. Then the other thing too is in tourism itself, we are living right now in the throes of COVID-19. One of the first things that hit was stopping the tourism trade. In the Gulf War in the early 1990s, and then SARS and so on, tourism was hit really badly. So we have had to start looking at other forms of development. Now, things like the climate change has created a new set of engagements that we can have. Protected areas are by no means all pristine. You have some of them which are degraded because of previous activities in there. We are actually doing rewilding programs right now. And the rewilding programs will occur in 12 of our protected areas throughout the state. We're planting 3.5 million trees, and the villagers are hired for that extended period, from taking the seeds, putting in nurseries, hardening them, all the way to planting and maintenance. And the corporate sector, through their ESGs and the CSRs, want to be carbon neutral. So protected areas have a thing which is different from your permanent forest estates. You have permanence, which means the trees will grow to its natural end. And in order to do this, we actually are looking at data. The data is audited. The internal audit team has gone down to the ground and found that we actually have 11% failure, and those will be replenished. And that kind of data and the revenue generated from them, because the villagers are working with us throughout the extended period, is an alternative revenue and economic incentive to try to get them to be working with us. The next question of yours is, how do we manage human-wildlife conflict if we actually are successful? We do education awareness as much as we can. With all humans, for those, this is something which I tend to say sometimes, we know it's not good to smoke, but hey, look, even in Singapore, you create certain spots for people to smoke when they're not supposed to smoke. We can do as much education as we can. We can create safe zones like CRZs for them. We are trying to make them aware of the importance of keeping within the line. But you will always, you will get some that will go beyond the line in the sand. For example, my gardener, my gardener's brother, he's a bush cutter. He cuts the grass every 4 weeks in my home. I like my garden to grow a little bit wild, and he mentioned to me that the brother goes down to the river. I said, don't do that. And he said, yeah, we earn 900 ringgit a day collecting udang galah, the big giant freshwater prawn, which is about 300 sing a day. And he did it, and he said, "Are you going to give us money to stay away from the rivers?" We couldn't find that kind of money. He lost his life. So when you actually have those kinds of reality that you face with, it's difficult. We appreciate it's difficult. We have welfare replenishment, and we have insurances by the state to try to give it back to them. But a loss of life is extremely shocking. So it is not easy, but we try to do the best that we can. Does that help, Ben?
Definitely, Melvin. Well, thanks for the the insights, and I think that's really a reality check, about communities living close beside in the territory of wildlife. The next question to you is easier. I see that you get into work with a lot of passion every day about the work that you do. And I hope that through your talk, and also I hope that you rub off some of this passion to the people around. So the next question is that do you have any advice for those interested in a career in wildlife management? Not just the young ones out there, or maybe people thinking of a career switch. What sort of advice do you have?
Seriously, you're paid to have fun. Literally, you're paid to have fun. Other people pay to go out into the forest to watch and look at animals. In wildlife conservation, when you're out there, you're literally watching the animals up front. You have the equipment, you have the space, you can have solace if you want, quiet. And this, you're doing something which actually literally helps the world. I'll give you an example. Behind me are a whole bunch of plants. Those bunch of plants need animals, bugs, insects to be pollinated and so on. Now, you can be a high-flying economist, banker, and all this. Now, if you guys want to follow me with this, there are 56 of you out there. I'll give, and there are others in the room. I'm going to do this, okay? I'm going to say to you, now stop breathing. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Breathe, breathe. At that time, in those 10 seconds, you cannot use any of the money in the world to give you air. But right now, the environmentalists, the conservationists are literally fighting to give you a chance for that air. Protecting those animals, allow those animals to pollinate the flowers, to disperse the seeds, to give back those trees that you are able to breathe in, to protect the marine out there where 50% of your oxygen comes from. If you want to contribute to the world, that's one way of looking at a time and a life in conservation. But you're literally paid to have fun. Hey, do it. I have had over 30 years of fun, and I'm still enjoying it. And I'm actually watching a slew of young people who are literally engaged and wanting to do it. And yesterday in NParks and the whole batch of young people as well. Give it a shot. Change your career. Give it a chance. You'll find it's much more rewarding and not as hard going as you think. Does it help, Ben?
I think there are certainly times of hardship in the field. We usually only the fun stuff are shown in documentaries or
yeah, indeed,
TV shows, and even crocodile. that's not a laughing matter. It's serious, and everybody has to be well trained in order
Exactly.
To keep the animal and as well as the people safe. Yeah. So my before I go into the next question, I just want everyone in the audience to maybe submit a vote for favorite questions in Slido on a QR code shown. And if you have not hit it in the Slido, please do so and enter the event code 225-3383, right? So Melvin, my next question is, it's about approaching stakeholders, and I guess this applies to us even in an urbanized state where we have a lot of urbanites who are neither interested nor knowledgeable about wildlife. What is the best way to approach stakeholders in your experience to help alleviate human wildlife conflict? How do you explain complex?
We tend to break it down into audiences. We break it down into what motivates them to try to stay engaged. For example, for local villages, let's start from for the urban side, where we have things like in the urban park of Samajaya, we found that the people just like to go there for jogging and all that. Initially, we had sort of permit system and a payment service to try to go in, but then we found that limits the number of people going in. There's discontent on that, and we don't get as much support. So when we open it up to be completely free, we found that the local people there were much more appreciative of the area, and the other urbanites then wanted creation of nature reserves in other places in the state, because they actually can see the utility of having a green area, and just in a simple way, going there for a walk, for a run, taking photographs, having their marriage photos taken on those sites. We have in some of our parks identified that as an important audience to target with. In other areas, it could be alternative revenues. In the rural areas, it tends to be alternative revenues because they live in the green already. Green is not what they are after. An ability to send their kids to school, whether it's in towns, in the universities, is what they are looking for, empowering themselves, increasing their education level. So it depends on the locations that we are working with, how we target them, if you will. So there's no silver bullet for us. We actually need to start thinking with greater detail and try the various forms of it. And we are literally organically changing. We had developed things like Q&As of how we try to engage with them, but we find that in each one of the sites, it is a little bit different. So I don't know if that helps, but to have a nimble group to be able to provide feedback is really, really very important.
As a younger team, in your group using social media help, how does that pan out for you?
The social media has changed the way we approach things. Initially, we thought social media was vitally important just for the younger people, but that's not all true. Your Facebooks are also used by the upper management. The Facebooks are also used by politicians, where you get complaints. Some of them tend to go into the older social media like Facebook, and addressing them becomes one needs to move faster to address them. The younger ones, if you use that word younger ones, the other broad set are your Twitters and your Instagrams. But Twitter is not strong in Malaysia, in Sarawak, minimal. But you would get Instagram and those popping up, and then they get fed into Facebook. And that's when we actually have a whole bunch of our comms people monitoring Facebook to try to address them. Where it is simple, they would address it themselves. Where it's technical, it will sometimes end up at my desk, and we'll provide a legitimate response for them.
It ends up at your desk. How hands-on that is, since you started off as the head of education and interpretation unit. The next question is actually deals with patterns in conflict animals. Has your team observed any patterns in conflict animals being reported in certain areas, and how receptive are the locals to this sort of management methods?
Where we in the urban areas, things like long-tailed macaques do pop up. They go into people's homes, they steal people's papayas. And
it's exactly like us in Singapore here.
You know what was really interesting was this.
Yeah.
One of our rangers was working to trying to remove the long-tailed macaques, right? And the long-tailed macaque was taking the papayas in the garden. The guy had 2 Mercedes Benzes and a Range Rover in there. And the guy was swearing at the ranger, saying, the macaques are taking my papaya. So the ranger, in all his naivety, said something like that. You have 2 Mercedeses and 1 Range Rover. Why don't you just go and buy some more papaya leh? You're so not generous to the papaya, to the long-tailed macaque. Long-tailed macaque got nothing to eat. We were all watching and like, oh my God, what is the rich guy going to say? He didn't. He was taken completely aback. He was like, oh, how? It came across like the person was so ungenerous to animals that it took a ranger saying a simple thing like that for him to stop. But the reality is sometimes we are really not that generous as humans. We should be much more and have a greater willingness to share our earth with fellow beings, albeit not human beings, but wildlife. But that ranger essentially gave us a really interesting approach to try to engage with human-wildlife conflict. Obviously, if you speak English really well and you're trying to do it that way, it doesn't really rub that off that well. But that naive-looking ranger, when he said it, it was like, ooh, that was a really good pushback. So sometimes long-tailed macaques are one of them. In the rural areas, you'd get things like crocodiles, which are popping up. We don't have issues as much of pigs in Sarawak, because pigs are a protein source which rural communities like to have. It's a legit protein source. Birds, we do have issues of birds at public utilities, whether it's churches, mosques, and all that. They do come in, you get complaints of wanting to remove them. Bats in the belfry, especially in medical facilities, and as the buildings get old, the crevices open up and you actually have pouch tomb bats going in. So the net effect is us trying to get them to renovate the building so that these holes do not continually appear, because bats are protected. These are some of the animals that actually pop up in terms of our human-wildlife conflict in Sarawak.
So, the the Wildlife Act is actually kind of followed quite closely, to prevent harm from coming to these sort of animals or conflict. But I guess sometimes it's also difficult because the people expect you to take some kind of action.
They do. They
in-
do. Yeah.
For these sort of conflict animals.
We do have sort of animal. I can't say them as animal friendly because they remove those animals. Cages that are put on the ground. For example, long-tailed macaques, they go into the cage and they can't get out, and then they're removed. For our long-tailed macaque issues, we actually have a release site for them. It's called Monkey Island, and it's not based on Kong Island and all that, those movies. It just happened to be called Monkey Island. They were released there. They are given a platform where food is provided. We have had camera traps put in there. They seem to be surviving and doing pretty well. So we have had removal of animals from conflict situations and placed in areas which in natural areas where humans are not there, and they seem to be doing okay. He's muted.
But thanks, Melvin. Yeah, so there's also a question I actually wanted to ask you. I think given your years in conservation, has your perspective of conservation and conservation of wildlife and people change throughout your career? And also what are some of the major challenges or gaps in wildlife management that is unique to Sarawak or to Malaysia?
It has tremendously changed. When I started work in conservation, there were essentially two of us in back then Forest Department. We were hired by an NGO to help the state develop its conservation programs. I remember very clearly we went into a lift and the lift closed, and the people in front of the lift spoke to each other loud enough for us to hear, saying, yeah, those two lah, environmentalists lah, at the back there lah, don't talk to them, they are anti-government people. This was in 1988. Now I walk into a room and an organization with 600 plus 700 strong doing conservation. Politicians are talking about it. The world is talking about it. We're having conventions on it. It is improving. The question is now, is it improving fast enough, or it is actually declining because consumerism and development is going at a much faster rate? I see optimism in parts. I see sadness in other parts. It affects me. The point is, I think if we live with a greater amount of hope, we actually have a chance. And I think if we live trying to give youth a chance, seriously giving youth a chance, we have a chance. Because we tend to think of, oh, silverbacks like myself with white hair, we know a whole bunch of stuff. Yeah, we do. We do have some form of wisdom, but the youth has the passion and the energy. And if we start engaging them both in whether they're 20-year-olds, 40-year-olds, and work together with them, there's continuity in trying to get them to go through. For example, if laws are changed, for example, you don't change laws every 2 years, you change laws every 10 years and so on, but they have to live through those laws and implement those laws. So if the youth are engaged and their thoughts and their views are engaged at that level, not as tokenism, but as actual providing information and getting it into some form of management, they can carry it through in the intervening years up to the end. Remember, we are not young. We will depend on the oxygen that they save for us in our older age. We have to open the door to allow them to be much more engaged, much more engaged than in my early career. And I do see it in some parts where there's greater engagement of that nature. The second one of your part of your question involves things like gaps and all that. In where we are, I've had this discussion yesterday after discussing with you guys on how we can improve ourselves in terms of Sarawak Forestry Corporation. We find that the detailedness of the work done in NParks is high. There's commitment. The younger folks are really wanting to be engaged. In our neck of the woods, we have not as much people. Some, if you want to use do we have enough tech, and so on. But if we approach it in a way that we collaboratively work together, we have a much greater chance. The reason I say this is the landscape of Sarawak, in terms of land mass alone, Singapore is 0.6 out of our land mass. Whatever we do, whether it's we in Sarawak, Indonesia, Peninsular Malaysia, and so on, affects Singapore. So having Singapore not providing, but supporting regional work is really useful. It actually helps Singapore, and it also helps us to be able to protect much better. Together we're pulling each other up in our bootstraps. If you look at that analogy, we actually have a much better chance. So collaborative work with Singapore is an important thing that we should be thinking about.
Well, Melvin, I think you kind of answered, the next question that I want to pose, actually, which is actually what lessons can be taken to Singapore's nature human, can be taken, I guess, to apply to Singapore's nature or wildlife human interactions on a smaller scale. And I think you have kind of summed it up, that we need to have more collaboration. But other than a sense of hope, we need greater hope in conservation, more optimism. We also need, I guess, greater tolerance. I mean, towards wildlife, especially on our much smaller island. View it in the context of what we experience in Sarawak with wildlife. Ours might not be, that serious. After all, and my hope is that everyone goes watching for wildlife in our nature reserves with a healthy dose of respect and keeping a distance, I guess, from whether in Sungai Buloh and in our Central Catchment Nature Reserve, and that's actually my hope, and I think what we have learned or seen, with your relation with the crocodile cases in Sarawak. So I'm actually going to with that I'd like to thank you for your very generous sharing, and also a big thank you to our audience for joining us on Zoom on a Saturday morning. So that's all we have for you, but do keep a lookout for the next session of our wildlife management webinar series, the international edition next month, featuring Professor Hitori Inari from Yamagata University in Japan. And of course, he'll be sharing with us about wildlife management in Japan, which is a totally different ballgame. So we'll be all looking forward to that, and thanks to all for attending the session, and have a great day ahead. Thank you very much.
Bye for now.